This video is sponsored by PCBWay. Hello there and welcome back to another video. In today's video, I'm going to be building a good old-fashioned jank build because man does it seem like literally everything surrounding tech right now is just depressing, sad, and prohibitively expensive. So let's go back to the basics and have some fun building a computer with an old office PC, a GPU that's several years old at this point but still decent, and an upgraded power supply. And I think I'll have a little bit of extra fun with this build in another way as well, as I want to build this in a way that it's janky, but not so janky that you wouldn't want to actually use it. So let's start out with what parts I'm going to be using today. The main system I think I'll be using is this Dell Optiplex 990 with an i7-2600 and 16GB of DDR3 RAM. And I'll be using this tower instead of the other ones that I have for a couple of reasons. One, it has very little resale value anyway, so cutting up the side panel and therefore destroying even more of the resale value won't hurt my wallet too much. And two, this is an old enough office PC to not suffer from the plague of proprietary power connectors everywhere. In fact, this PC uses a regular ATX motherboard and CPU connector, so it's super easy to swap in a higher power PSU that could also power a graphics card, something that we'll definitely need. As for the graphics card I'll be using, I could go for something really stupid like my RTX 3070, but let's keep this build at least somewhat reasonable. So I'm thinking to use this GTX 980, which will also allow me to stick to a cheaper 450 watt power supply for the whole build. And just like that, we've got a janky little gaming PC. And while this setup does absolutely work, it takes up a lot of space and honestly is super impractical. I know there are tons of people who actually run their computers like this, and while I understand the appeal, that being that it's super cheap, it's not something that I'd personally want to use, just because it's so delicate and fragile. Literally bumping it the wrong way can throw the whole system off, and I accidentally did this while playing Forza on it. I was curious about how hot the GTX 980 was, so I touched it and crashed the computer really hard. It ended up taking several full power cycles and a full GPU reseat to get it to be happy with life again. So while I'm fully in support of shoehorning a big GPU and a new power supply into a small old office PC, I want to see if I can do this in a bit more of a purposeful and integrated feeling manner, making use of 3D printing to make brackets to mount the GPU and PSU. So here's the plan. I want to keep all of the regular Office PC parts inside of the Office PC's case, minus the power supply, as we'll be replacing that with my Corsair CX450M that I have laying around. Then, I want to be able to close the side panel on the Office PC and mount the new power supply and GTX 980 GPU on the outside of the case with some custom-made brackets. I think this will end up looking really cool, and since the GTX 980 is a pretty sleek looking card, it's also a decent way to show it off. Then, to handle the cabling between the GPU, power supply, and the rest of the Office PC, I'll cut a couple of holes into the side panel for my PCI Express riser and for the power supply's cables. And conveniently, because we'll have removed our Office PC's power supply, we can tuck all of the extra length of the cables from the new one into the bottom of the Office PC for, hopefully, a pretty clean look. So after taking several measurements and fabricating part of the GPU bracket to use as a prototype, I was able to mark out the cut that I would have to make to the side panel for the GPU riser cable. I took the panel down to the garage and spent a while with a Dremel cutting out the marked off rectangle from the side panel. And once I was done with that, I test fitted the prototype bracket with the riser and the side panel to see how it would fit. Thankfully, everything seems to fit quite well. However, this GPU mount doesn't end here, because I need to expand this bracket to not just hold the riser cable's end, but also to hold the PCIe bracket of the GPU for some added structural integrity. After I knew the cutout was good, I put some electrical tape on the edges of it to keep any leftover sharp edges from cutting into the PCI Express riser cable, as if the cable gets cut and shorted out, it could be damaging enough to permanently break the PCI Express slot on the motherboard. After adding to the graphics card mount design so that it would be able to hold the whole GPU securely, I printed out this bracket and test fitted it to find out that I severely needed to revise the dimensions. And so, while I was waiting for graphics card vertical mount bracket 2.0 to to print out, I chose to move on to cutting the hole for all of the power supply cables out of the panel, because cutting these holes actually ends up taking me quite a while. And that's because I'm scared of the Dremel cutting discs exploding, and so I don't dare use the high speed setting on my Dremel, causing it to take forever to cut these holes out. If you have any tips on how to stop these discs from exploding, please leave them in the comments, because I would really like to stop having that happen. In any case, getting a head start on this was wise, and after cutting out a decent sized hole behind the back end of the GPU so that the cables going into the case would be hidden, I sealed off the sharp edges with electrical tape, and finally, the new GPU bracket was ready. After switching the old version out for the new one, I slotted the GPU in and was met with a much better fit and proper alignment on the screw holes for the PCI Express slot bracket. So, knowing now that the bracket could hold the GPU properly in place, I laid some blue painter's tape down on the side panel so that it would be easy to mark all of the screw hole locations, and proceeded to do exactly that. And before I went down to drill these holes, I actually marked some more holes, this time for the power supply's mounting bracket, which I designed and printed while fiddling around with the new graphics card bracket. This piece is really simple and just mounts to the side panel with 6 M3 bolts and nuts, and then the ATX power supply screws into it with 2 screws. I placed the power supply bracket above where the top of the GPU would be, and marked all 6 holes for it, as well as 4 more holes that somewhat surrounded the path the power supply's power cables would take into the case. These holes would allow me to easily route some zip ties through the side panel to secure the power cables to the side panel for cable management's sake. Because, hey, I want this thing to look cool, that's part of the point of this. And while I finish up marking all of these holes, I would like to take a second to talk about today's video sponsor, PCBWay. PCBWay is a company that offers high-quality manufacturing services, including PCB manufacturing and assembly, CNC machining, and one that's super pertinent to this project, 3D printing. If you're considering taking on a project like this, either to genuinely use the computer or just to have a fun weekend project to work on, but you don't have your own 3D printer, you can get all of the brackets, which I'll be open sourcing for anyone to download, 3D printed by PCBWay in whatever material you need. I've been working with PCBWay for years now, and their products have added so much to so many of my projects. Their quality is exceptional, and I've had exceptional experiences with their customer service. If PCBWay and their services interest you at all, go ahead and check them out at my referral link in the video description. And thank you again to PCBWay for sponsoring today's video. Now that I'm back from the garage with a side panel that's got a lot of holes in it, I can begin mounting these brackets with some M3 bolts and nuts. Sadly, I did make a minor mistake on the power supply bracket, meaning that 2 of its screws cannot be installed because there's something directly under the panel in that area that interferes with them. However, 4 screws should be plenty for a basic 450 watt power supply. If it was a beastly 1600 watt unit, I'd feel differently, but thankfully it's not. With both of my 3D printed brackets mounted to the side panel, which I should mention at this point were 3D printed out of PETG, because though they're not really in direct contact with the hottest parts of the components, they probably will end up absorbing a decent amount of heat, and I didn't want to risk a less temperature resistant plastic, such as PLA, deforming. You wouldn't want your GPU to flop off the side of your computer while you're in an intense gaming session, would you? The final thing I did before mounting the parts to the side panel and the panel to the case was installing this little cover for the empty hole where the OEM PSU went. I figured that it would make this build feel a little more polished to cover this gaping hole in the case, and it might also help with airflow by forcing the case fan to actually push its air over the motherboard instead of straight out of a large hole in the back of the case. Once the PSU was mounted, it was a bit of an awkward situation of trying to plug things in while the side panel was tethered to the case, and I also had to make sure the PCI Express riser was plugged into the motherboard and was passing through its correct hole and not getting pinched at the same time. However, after just a little bit of a struggle, I was left with this. The side panel on the PC, the motherboard, CPU, and SATA power cables ran inside of the computer and connected, and the PCI Express riser hanging out of the side, as well as my PCI Express power cable. Then I mounted the riser to the GPU bracket with the M3 screws I had designed the bracket to use, and I got the GTX 980 plugged in and screwed into place. I did have to temporarily unmount the PSU to reach these screws, but thankfully that was only 2 screws and didn't take long at all. Once the power supply and graphics card were back and mounted fully, I plugged the PCI Express power cables into the GPU and tucked the excess cable into the hole into the main PC chassis. I also tightened down the zip ties that ran through the holes in the side panel to secure all of the cables, and just like that, we've got a pretty sweet looking PC. Though it is a little bit unstable, so I 3D printed a stand for it and hot glued it to the bottom of the system. And now I don't have to worry about it falling over. Alright, that's this build done. I'll be honest, this was a weekend project for me, and it was so much fun to mess around with. I thought that this might be a fun video to make, both for myself and to just put an inexpensive, fun project out there in the computer world. Because again, everything feels very bad right now in this hobby, but certain parts don't necessarily have to. Also, before I say goodbye, I would like to address the fact that I don't give any performance numbers in this video, and that's because I've already done a video on the GTX 980. Albeit not with an i7-2600, but that video should give a rough idea on how this card will perform in modern games, and I don't want to provide redundant info. Well, that's all that I have to show you in this video. I hope that you were able to at least enjoy it, and maybe even learn a thing or two. In any case, I hope to see you next time. Goodbye.